Hello, and welcome to a training presentation from Vigilant Fire Service Training. This lesson is going to be on SizeUp, specifically the Vigilant Fire Service Training 5-step method for fireground SizeUp. To accompany this lesson, your training officer should have provided you with two documents, a lesson worksheet, as well as the quiz for the lesson. We will begin this lesson with a review of our last lesson, Strategy, Tactics, and Tasks. And if you remember, in Strategy, Tactics, and Tasks, we discussed the fireground trinity. And the idea behind the fireground trinity is that to operate on the fireground, we want to remain safe, effective, and efficient. Safe fireground operation comes from selecting the appropriate strategy. An effective fireground happens by selecting appropriate tactics. And we become efficient on the fireground through the assignment of efficient tasks. And that's done at the company level. Let's look at safety first and a safe strategy. Strategy is a high-level plan to achieve one or more goals under conditions of uncertainty. Strategy is selected as a result of the fireground risk assessment. Depending on the acceptable risk level, one of three operation modes is chosen. When we have a high potential for reward, we're willing to have a high level of risk. And when there's a high level of risk, we are typically operating in the offensive mode. Transitional mode of operation happens when we have to take an initial step to lessen the risk to equal the potential for reward. And that's what we call transitional. And in this case, we simply have to put a knock on the fire from the outside before we can advance to the interior. Effective tactics. A tactic is a procedure for completing a desired result. The tactic is the means by which the strategy is carried out. A tactic is a skillful way of making something happen. When we're talking about tactics, we break them up into two separate categories, primary and secondary. Each one of these primary and secondary categories has 5 subcategories. So we have 5 primary tactics. Those 5 primary tactics are suppression, search, ventilation, water supply, and backup line. Now our secondary tactics that we select are controlling those utilities, obtaining secondary water, performing a secondary search, making sure that we do an extensive extension recon, and performing salvage and overhaul. Our efficient tasks. A task is a defined piece of work assigned to or expected of a company. The smallest identifiable and essential piece of work. Tasks usually refer to clearly defined pieces of work, sometimes short in duration, assigned to or expected of a company or a person. And we look at a couple of our different tactics and tasks here. We have water supplies, making municipal water supply, a rescue, not just a rescue anymore, it's a ladder rescue, ventilation, whether it's going to be performed vertically or horizontally, as well as suppression. Either we're stretching a line or we're using master streams, depending on the situation, which again falls back on our strategy, tactics, and task selection according to that fireground risk management assessment. So, how do we select strategy, prioritize tactics, and assign tasks? SizeUp. SizeUp is how we do that. So let's take a look at today's objectives. Following this presentation, the firefighter will be able to list 5 phases of SizeUp. Describe the procedure for completing SizeUp. Perform a primary SizeUp. Defining SizeUp. So define SizeUp in your own words right now. At Vigilant, we define SizeUp as a continuous systematic assessment of the contributing fireground factors using physical observations, condition reports, and transmitted benchmarks to specifically define, clarify, and evaluate strategy, tactics, and tasks. Now that is quite the definition. And are you going to remember this definition at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're faced with a house fire, presenting fire out of multiple windows? More than likely not. So what we want to do is we want to just pull 3 key words out of here to really define what SizeUp should be. And those 3 words that we're going to pull out of here are assessment, systematic, and continuous. We pull out our training notebook and we're going to pull apart those 3 words. Okay? Continuous. That's an ongoing operation that simply doesn't stop. It means it happens consistently, constantly. It's systematic. That means there's a procedure, a process to it. There's a process and a procedure to make the SizeUp systematic. And it's an assessment. Assessment simply means an evaluation. It's a tool by which we evaluate what's happening on the fireground. Let's look at an acronym from the Fire Department of New York regarding SizeUp. Coal was wealth. Coal was wealth is designed to give us all the little parts of what we should know during a SizeUp, or all that little bit of information and data that we should obtain during a SizeUp. I was first taught coal was wealth, taking my first officer classes nearly 20 years ago now. I've seen coal was wealth multiple times in multiple classes since then. However, as much as I've been exposed to this, it's almost impossible for me to remember each and every part of the coal was wealth. In fact, while doing the research to make this lesson, I had to look up what each one of these letters actually represented. Let's go over them in order. C is for construction. The O in coal is occupancy. The A, area and height. The L, the life hazard. So we can see that the coal in the word coal was, or the coal represents the building. Let's look at was. The W represents water. A is auxiliary system. So that's sprinkler systems. Is there a FDC? Is there a standpipe? And S is street conditions. Let's look at wealth. Wealth tells us what is the weather? What do our exposures look like? What is our apparatus and our personnel on those apparatus? What manpower do we have available to us? L is location. Where is the fire? T is time. What time of day is it? And H is the hazard. So what is the hazard? So as you can see, this is quite an extensive look at a SizeUp. And there's a lot of information to be gathered here and a lot of information to be collected as data. However, the problem is remembering what coal was wealth and the definition of that. Let's put it into our training notebook and ask a couple of questions. Is coal was wealth continuous? Well, there's nothing really in the coal was wealth to tell us that this should be ongoing, but we know it should be ongoing, but it hasn't been proceduralized. or turned into a system. We had a little bit of a system because we saw coal represented basically the building that was involved. The W, or was, represented what was going on at street level with our water. And the wealth represented the situation that we were presented with. But it really didn't have an actual systematic approach. Now, was coal was wealth a great assessment? Absolutely. Coal was wealth is a fantastic assessment. So what if we took that acronym, coal was wealth, and turned it into a systematic procedure that was continuously developed and ongoing throughout the fire scene? When we do that, when we make it systematic, we basically turn it into the Vigilant Method for SizeUp. The Vigilant Method for SizeUp is conducted in 5 distinct phases. Each phase has objectives. Each phase collects data. Each phase is communicated via the radio. And each phase supports the next phase. Each phase provides baseline data for the fireground assessment. That fireground assessment feedback loop is something we're going to talk about in further lessons. But understand that each one of these phases is meant to give a little bit of more information into that feedback loop, that fireground assessment feedback loop. The Vigilant Fire Service SizeUp training method has 5 different phases. These phases are preliminary, initial, primary, focused or secondary, and the functional phase. The preliminary phase takes place prior to the event even happening, while the initial phase takes place when the call hits. The primary phase takes place upon the arrival of the first unit, and that focused or secondary phase takes immediately after. The functional phase is continuous throughout the event and is repeated as the event grows in time. Let's take a look at each one of these phases, beginning with the preliminary. As we said, the preliminary phase is conducted prior to the incident taking place. The reason or the intent of this phase is to prepare the firefighter for a potential response. Our known factors at this time are, we know the target hazards in our fire district. We know the weather. We know what trends are happening. We know the status of our apparatus, and we know what season this is. So when we're talking about target hazards, those are the things inside your fire district that pose an extraordinary hazard. They're above and beyond your 1- and 2-story residence. They're your buildings that have special occupancies, or maybe they have special operations or special environmental concerns. The weather happens seasonal. We have seasonal weather, and then we have out of seasonal weather. So what is the weather that's happening on the time frame that we're talking about this preliminary SizeUp? And preliminary SizeUps is something that should happen every single morning. I like to say when you get out of bed and get in the shower and brush your teeth, you should be thinking about your preliminary SizeUp for the day. What's the weather going to be like for that day? What are the trends? What's happening currently in your fire district? What types of responses have you been going on for the past several weeks or months? What is the status of your apparatus? Are all your apparatus in service, or is your frontline ladder truck out of service? And what season is it? Beyond weather, what season is it? Is it Black Friday and it's shopping season, where the roads in your commercialized areas are going to be a little bit heavier trafficked? Or is it the middle of summer, when you know that some of your target hazards with special occupancies like schools aren't going to be occupied? The communication of this SizeUp happens through our pre-plans, through training, through bulletins, and through special announcements that come from the chief's office. That's how we communicate this preliminary SizeUp to our firefighters. We basically define the pre-incident risk assessment during the preliminary SizeUp phase. Let's take a look at our initial SizeUp phase. Our initial SizeUp phase happens when the alarm is received. It happens on the reception of the alarm. We use this SizeUp because we want to prepare the firefighter for the actual response. It gives us several known factors. We now know the time of day, the location, the nature of the incident, and what the initial apparatus assignment is going to be for this response. This is communicated through dispatch via the radio, MDT printout, digital apps, pagers, and a variety of other options that are dependent to your individual fire department. The initial SizeUp phase, basically, it defines the initial incident parameters. What it is we're going for, where it is we're going, and why we're going. The primary SizeUp phase, and this is the SizeUp phase that we're going to focus on the most for this lesson. The reason we're going to focus on this is because this is one of the, if not most important SizeUps that happen during these 5 phases. This SizeUp takes place upon arrival of the first unit. It is conducted to paint a picture of the fire ground, okay, and prioritize the needs of the fire ground. It gives us for the first time what our primary hazard is going to be. We now know what the life hazard looks like, where our water source is going to come from, and what the building demographics are. It is communicated through something we call the soap water radio transmission. And soap water is an acronym for our primary SizeUp points that need to be hit when we're making that initial on-location report. And this is going to define our strategy, tactic, and task. What's happening during the primary SizeUp is we're combining the preliminary and the initial. So we're taking what could be with what might be with what actually is happening. And that's the whole basis of our primary SizeUp. Our focus SizeUp takes place immediately following the primary SizeUp. We conduct this SizeUp to provide a thorough 360-degree interpretation of the fire ground. We call this SizeUp 3D in HD. We want to see all floors, all sides, all parts of the situation that we've been presented with. This is going to give us the layout of the fire ground, and we're going to understand the structure. Is it a 2-story from the front with a 3-story from the rear? Is side A going to be the street side? Or is this a corner lot where side A needs to be defined opposite of the street that we were given the location of? This is communicated during the initial benchmark. We're not going to talk at length about benchmarks in this lesson. We'll get deeper into the benchmarking process in the communications lesson. But we communicate this in our initial benchmark when we're either declaring this a working fire or declaring it an investigation or whatever the scene might be developing into. This SizeUp defines the initial task assignments in the baseline fire ground assessment. At this point, we're going to begin to create that fire ground feedback assessment loop. And we want to have a baseline. And this is going to obtain our baseline. This is like taking your blood pressure of a trauma victim. Our first blood pressure only gives us a baseline. We're looking for changes beyond the first one when we take the second to third and the fourth blood pressures. We're looking for what changes are happening. This is going to make our initial baseline, like taking that first blood pressure. Our functional SizeUp is going to take place throughout the incident. This is how our phase up becomes continuous. So it takes place continuously throughout the incident. This provides updated data for the fire ground assessment feedback loop. This is where we start obtaining our second and third blood pressures. It's going to let us know how the fire ground is evolving. Our known factors here is our tactical effectiveness and our CAN report information. We've assigned tactics, we've assigned tasks. Are those tactics and tasks becoming effective? Are they working? And we're going to understand how efficient the tasks are from feedback of CAN reports, or the conditions, actions, and need report information coming back from the companies who are operating on the fire ground. This lesson's not going to dive deep into CAN reports. Again, we'll touch on those in a later lesson called Fireground Communications. But this SizeUp also is communicated via interval benchmarks. These are your timed benchmarks, whether it's 10, 15, or 20 minutes. When the fire dispatcher comes on and asks incident command, or basically prods incident command and says, you're at your 20-minute mark, this is where we insert the functional communication, or I should say the functional SizeUp communication. And the functional SizeUp communication defines the operational status of the fireground. It's that simple. Now I want to take a deeper look into primary SizeUp. Primary SizeUp is described as arguably the most important command function of the incident. The primary SizeUp. 1. Sets the emotional tone for the entire incident. If the first arriving unit gets on location and is screaming over the radio and short of breath, the arriving units behind the initial unit are going to take on that emotional response. We're already pulling up on an emotionally stressful incident here, no matter if it's a fire or a motor vehicle accident. We're pulling up on something that is going to cause stress to our responders. How we set that tone of our first initial arriving unit is going to spread throughout the other units. We may pull up on an extremely bad fire with 4 or 5, well, maybe 3 or 4 buildings involved, with maybe 4 or 5 cars and several victims. How we set that tone during that primary SizeUp is going to make or break the rest of the incident as far as units coming in. If we're excited and we're boisterous and our voice is getting loud and our speech rate is increased, other companies are going to pick up on that. But what it won't do is it's not going to help the situation in any way, shape, or form. The more excited we get on the radio doesn't mean the more effective or efficient we're going to be on the fireground. It almost means the opposite. So it's going to set the emotional tone. It's also going to determine the initial operating strategy. What is our risk assessment here? What are we willing to risk? And remember, when we say willing to risk, we mean what are we willing to give up to take in turn of the reward that we're presented with. It's also going to prioritize the primary tactic. What's our primary tactic going to be? What tactic out of our selection of the 5 primary and 5 secondary, which one of those 10 things is going to best impact this incident? What thing can I do with my first unit to best impact the incident? And it's going to assign the most critical task of that tactic. So in other words, if I've chosen suppression as my primary tactic, is stretching a line to the seat of the fire going to do the most damage? Or stretching a line to the seaside to put a line on a developing fire on the rear of the structure going to support the incoming ladder companies who are going to perform searches on the 1st and 2nd floor? And it's going to identify our water supply source. And that's going to become very important because we want to identify the who, when, where, and how our water supply is going to be taken care of. To help with this primary SizeUp, Vigilant has developed what we call SOAP water SizeUp, or a SOAP water acronym to help you understand your primary SizeUp. SOAP water. And let's take a little deeper look at it. The S stands for structure. The O is our observation. A is action. P is plan. And water, as we said, what is our water source? The who, when, where, and how is water going to be obtained? Let's take a look at each one of these a little bit deeper. S stands for structure. And there's 3 components to the structure that we want to understand. We want to understand the structure's size, its type, and its occupancy. Let's look at size first. Size, obviously we want to know the height, the width, and the length, or what we call area. Often, the area doesn't become as important as the height. So how do we judge height of the building? Height of the building is really easy to judge simply by calling out the number of floors that the building is. Area gets a little bit harder to understand. So how do we know what area of the building is large compared to small? Your idea of large and my idea of large could be two completely separate things. However, I can walk into any single firehouse across America and tell them what a large building looks like inside of their response area. Because when we talk about large buildings, we want to define large buildings as a building in which the area exceeds the length of your primary pre-connected lines. So in other words, if I have a 200-foot pre-connected line and my building area is larger than what my 200-foot pre-connected line can reach, then that area or that building is large. That puts the same playing field on every single building that we go to. Type. Type of construction. Is it type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, type 5? Those are the NFPA types of building constructions. And we're going to get deeper into building construction and each one of those types in a further lesson called building construction. But we want to know, what is the building type? Is it a type 3 ordinary building where we know that fire can travel in void spaces relatively easily? Or is it a type 5 timber frame, or excuse me, not timber frame, lightweight frame construction building that has a potential for collapse and injuring our firefighters? We want to know how that building type is going to interact with the situation that we have in front of us and how we're going to attack that situation. And probably most important of all of these is occupancy. We want to know who uses the building and why they use it and what the building is used for. Occupancy becomes important because our number one goal when we arrive on scene of a fire ground is to protect life and then property. Well, if we're going to protect life, we need to know who is there, who's occupying the building, where they would be occupying this building, and what they're doing in different portions of the building. Observations. We want to know three key things here in our observations. We want to know location of smoke, fire, and victims. We just keep it that simple in the initial stages. We just want to know, is there visible smoke? Is there visible fire? And do we have confirmed victims? Action. That primary action that we're going to take. What action can we take right now to best rectify this situation? Or what can I do with my available resources on scene right now to make this situation better? Typically, that's going to be suppression, rescue, or some sort of ventilation. But it's all going to be dependent on that initial size up. Our plan is our strategy. That high-level plan is a strategy. And that strategy is going to be based on our risk assessment. What are we willing to give up to take on the reward? If we're willing to give up a lot because there's a lot of reward to be had, then our strategy is going to be offensive. If we don't want to risk a lot, then our strategy is going to be defensive. And if there is a bunch of stuff to win on this fire ground, but we have to mitigate some of that risk before we can take action, then that's going to be our transitional strategy or our transitional plan. Real important to say here that we're stretching a line offensively as opposed to just stretching a line. Because if our action is stretching a line, it could be offensive or it could be defensive. But we need to communicate that to everyone who's arriving on the fire ground so that they understand what level of risk everyone will be willing to take on this fire ground. And then water. We want to know the who, when, where, and how of the water supply. Who's going to obtain the water supply? In other words, what company is assigned the water supply? How are they going to get it? Are they going to stretch off of the base pumper? Or are they going to lay out to a hydrant? Where are they going to get it from? Are they getting it from a hydrant? Or are they going to get it from a stream? Are they getting it from a hydrant that's around the block? Or are we going to be setting up a portable pond transfer? Who, when, where, and how we obtain the water supply. It must happen during that primary size up. So let's take this lesson to the next step and start applying what we've just learned in that soap water application. To do that, let's get out the worksheet that's been provided to you by your training officer. And it's titled Vigilant Fire Service Training Lesson Worksheet. And you can look through here and it says the category is organization, the topic is fireground operations, and the lesson is SizeUp. So that's the worksheet that you should be working off of as we move through the second half of this lesson. So SizeUp, we wanted to talk about structure, observation, action, plan, and water. So here we have our structure. What is this structure? Well, if I look at the structure, I can instantly tell it's a single family residence. So there's our occupancy. What type of building construction is this, do you believe? I believe it to be type 5. I don't see anything different. And what is the size of this building? Well, it's a 1-story. And it's definitely not large. I believe that my pre-connect, even of 100 feet, could reach the majority of this building. What do I see here? What can I see? Well, I have smoke visible from the front door. So I could say smoke from side A, or I could be more specific and say I have smoke exiting the front door. What's going to be my action? What step here can do the most amount of damage to the scene for the better? What one thing can I do to mitigate this situation as we see it? So here I'm thinking I'm going to probably stretch a line via suppression, or via the suppression tactic, put a line in operation. Putting this fire out is going to stop the situation. I don't see victims. The house looks to be abandoned, but the fire started somehow. But I'm not positive of a victim, and I haven't been told there's victims inside. So I think the first action I can take here to make the biggest impact on the scene is suppression. Now, how am I going to do that suppression? That comes via my plan. What is my risk versus reward? How much risk, what am I willing to give up to take on? The reward here would be a fast knockdown on this fire. My risk would be obviously getting trapped inside this fire as it accelerates itself into the next phase of fire. But I believe I'm making a good risk assessment by saying that if I get one crew inside that door and knock the fire down quickly, I think I can stop this situation. So I'm willing to risk firefighters going on the offensive here. It looks to be one room inside that door, and I could probably have a good knock on that fire from the front door. So my plan here is going to be offensive strategy. My water source, I'll make up the water sources for us as we look at these, but I'm going to say that this water source is really easy for us. It's a hydrant right in front of the house. So my overall soap water size up in this situation would look something like this. Engine 1, on location. I got a single story residence, smoke from the front door. We will be stretching a line offensive. We have water at the base pumper, next in engine to make the hydrant. So what have I done there? I've said exactly what the building is. I've told you exactly what I see, what my action is going to be, and what my plan is, what my overall strategy is. And I've assigned the who, when, where, and how of water because I've said we have water at the base pumper, but we can't make it because we're stretching the line. So now the second in engine is going to make the hydrant for us. So let's have you go through this one. What is the S here? And write down on your worksheet. There's space that's been given to define the SOAP and water on your worksheet. Let's work through this and you define on your worksheet what SOAP water is. Pause the video here if you need a minute to fill out your worksheet. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to begin to move into actual size ups, where you're going to be performing the size up yourself. So here's our first building. You can see what's going on here. And I'm going to tell you that the water supply here is going to be a municipal fire hydrant that's located 3 addresses down from this structure. So take a moment here, pause this lesson, pause this video at this point, and go through your worksheet and write down what your soap water arrival preliminary size up radio transmission would look like or sound like. Go ahead and write that on your worksheet. Okay, so we're going to move into our second primary size up scenario now. So again, for this one, we're going to do the same exact thing. For this one, our water source is going to be right in front of this house. There is a hydrant in front of this house. But for your soap water size up, I want you to make sure that you describe the who, when, where, and how water supply is going to happen. I also want to make sure that you, in your size up on your worksheet, that you identify what is the number one action here that we need to do to help this situation. Pause the video if you have to, complete your worksheet, and then we'll move on to the third scenario. So again, work yourself through this size up. This is a typical fire that any fire district would respond to on any given day, anywhere in the United States. Perform your primary size up, write it on paper as you would transmit it on the radio. Pause the video here to complete your worksheet, and then we'll move on to the fourth and final. So this is our fourth and final scenario. And by this point, you've gotten the idea of how the soap water method works. What I want you to take a real note of here is structure and occupancy. Focus in on what type of building construction we have here and what the occupancy is. Because this is where size up gets important. There are two frames of thought when we're talking about radio transmissions. One frame of thought is that we should say anything and everything that we find via radio transmission. The other way of thought is that we should say the least amount of vocabulary via radio transmission as possible. Vigilant takes a standpoint somewhere in the middle. What we would like to see is that you put forth pertinent information. If I'm responding to a residential box in my first due area, and I know that every house in that box should be a single family residence, type 5 construction, I don't need to pull up on location and say, I'm on location with a type 5 wood frame building, single family residence, multi-floor building. It's assumed if we're going to a residential box that we're pulling up on a type 5 ordinary construction building. However, should I respond to that same box and find myself with a type 3 ordinary construction building, I need to reiterate that. That's something I should get out on the radio. I'm on location. I have a type 3 ordinary construction single family residence as opposed to a type 5 framed construction residence. There's a big difference there. There's a big difference. So take some extra time as you fill out your fourth and final scenario here to understand what the building construction is here as well as the occupancy. It becomes important in a lot of the fires that we respond to. So this will complete today's lesson on SizeUp. Your training officer has provided you with a 10-question quiz. Please complete that quiz and return it to your training officer. And until next time, remember, tomorrow's victory is a result of today's training. Be safe out there.